Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, whether it's good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I know everyone is tuning in from all over the world. It is such an honor to be able to share my work that I've done over the past year for my capstone in coastal science and policy. And boiled down, what it comes down to was learning how to build climate resilience on farms and in cities. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge that all of the land that I have ever and will ever live, learn, or work on was land from which Indigenous people were forcibly removed. These people lived in a reciprocal relationship with the land, whether they were and are the Amamutsin of the Santa Cruz area, the Kanaka Maoli of my home in Hawaii, or the Lenape people who lived on Manhattan. And next, before I begin, I wanted to thank all of those who have taught, supported, mentored, and challenged me. My advisors, Leonard Diggs, Jared Lawson, Sarah Newkirk, and Marcy Bortman, my academic teachers, Christy Croker, Don Kroll, Daniel Press, Erica Zavaleta, Mark Carr, of course, Sarah Emmenheiser and Ann Kapuczynski, my friends and family, especially my partner Leland for his unwavering support, and my mom for raising me in the rainforest and teaching me empathy. And most especially to my beloved cohort. What a wild ride it's been. I really miss you all. So let's begin with why I'm interested in this work. It starts with where I'm from. I was born and raised on the Big Island of Hawaii, and the Native Hawaiians manage their lands at the watershed scale. Each watershed is called an ahupua'a. From the trees along the mountain ridges to the fish ponds along the coast, it's understood in Hawaiian culture that all is connected. It's intuitive, but unfortunately pretty rare in modern, and might I add, colonial conservation practice. What I've realized over the years is that the vast majority of our conservation efforts are focused at the top of the watershed, or in pristine pockets scattered throughout. And that work is critically important. We must, of course, preserve and protect the naturally thriving ecosystems that we have left. But what about the rest of it? I've become increasingly interested in and passionate about how we can apply what we've learned from studying and conserving pristine ecosystems to other, perhaps not so pristine places. And so, here I am. I came to the Coastal Science and Policy program to learn about how we can take what we know about healthy landscapes, their geology, their botany, hydrology, evolutionary ecology, and apply it towards climate adaptation that's not only resilient, but it is also an opportunity to build a more just, equitable, and healthy future. Because I've got some hard truths for you. I'm a blunt optimist, so bear with me. One, we have misunderstood and abused our relationship with the land. Our society, as a result, some might say, is extremely vulnerable to climate change. And our racial inequality crisis that we're feeling so deeply is intertwined with our climate crisis. And so with all of these hard truths in mind, I spent the last year trying to understand what resilient climate adaptation might look like in two specific areas of the watershed that I decided to zoom in on. One, agricultural landscapes, and two, disaster-prone urban settings. And for each of those, I worked with a different organization. One, Pie Ranch, is a small organic educational farm about 30 miles up the coast from Santa Cruz. I lived and worked there for 3 months last summer. The Nature Conservancy is one of the biggest conservation organizations in the world. I worked across chapters from many different states, but most closely with the disaster resilience team in California and the climate adaptation team in New York. And for both organizations, my job was something like what I'm doing with you right now in this presentation. I helped to clarify and codify their roles in solving pretty complicated and tangled problems. For them, I built networks of experts, produced literature reviews, and I wrote a number of reports to help with fundraising and program development. But for you all, just a few more slides in about 10 minutes. So let's start with Pie Ranch. Pie Ranch recently acquired this parcel of land called Cascade Ranch. It's 418 acres of coastal farmland. Cascade Ranch has been a Brussels sprout farm for decades. Before that, it was a dairy. and it resembles much of our farmland across the country. It requires a ton of water in a pretty drought-prone area. Pallets upon pallets of chemicals are applied to the crops to keep them safe from bugs and pests. And unfortunately, the farm is vulnerable to supply chain inefficiencies, such as this one that left this whole crop of Brussels sprouts with nowhere to go but the field to rot in. And the vision that that Pie Ranch has for Cascade Ranch is that it becomes a model for what farming could and should look like if it is truly regenerative and climate resilient. And so regenerative usually means that a landscape is improved when it's farmed by various practices, rather than merely extracted from. But the vision for Cascade Ranch defines regeneration a little more holistically. It's regenerative for human communities as well as ecological. And so I spent 3 months interviewing ecologists, indigenous leaders, beginning and expert farmers, and food policy advocates. I developed this document that I'm holding here, which details the visions and steps towards implementation so that Pie Ranch can move forward with program development, including fundraising, farmer recruiting, etc. And I pulled out one example here, this field that's highlighted, that I think should remain in native grasses because of its slope, historical flooding, and proximity to other pieces of the property. And so to sort of sum up my work with Pie Ranch and show y'all what truly climate resilient farming might look like, I wanted to share with you our vision. Cascade Farm and Ranch Regenerator is a model for a world in which working landscapes are resilient to climate change and contribute to carbon mitigation while supporting healthy ecosystems and diverse societies. And this is my advisor, Leonard Diggs, who taught me the importance of compassion and of choosing your words carefully. And I'm so grateful to him for his mentorship. Second, Cascade Farm and Ranch Regenerator is a model for a world in which farmers and ranchers, especially women and people of color like Jose, a rosemary farmer in Pescadero, have access to community, knowledge, land, and capital to build solvent and sustainable enterprises that support their communities. And lastly, Cascade Farm and Ranch Regenerator is a model for a world in which all people have access to healthy food and find value in knowing where their food comes from. And so I learned a bit about what resilient climate adaptation might look like on agricultural landscapes. But what about in cities on the coast or urban settings along a river floodplain? And so the question that I asked when I was working with the Nature Conservancy from last fall through June of this year is, how can we make cities more resilient to climate change? Images like this are all too familiar. Houses repeatedly flood because we've built them in the floodplains. We have for a really long time, and it's not slowing down anytime soon. For some, adapting to climate change might look like this: build a wall to keep the water out. This is a seawall in Galveston, Texas, that unfortunately was overtopped just a few years after it was built because the engineers didn't anticipate how quickly the sea level would rise. Another option, and the one that my work with the Nature Conservancy focused on, is that rather than building a wall to keep water out and really crossing your fingers that you did your math right, you get out of the way. This is often called managed retreat or strategic retreat. You might have seen it in the headlines. The government has programs to facilitate retreat. The way it works is the government buys your house, you move somewhere else, the house gets knocked down, and there are restrictions on the land so that it's never developed again. Ideally, a community bands together, every family is fairly compensated, and moves to higher ground. The entire neighborhood is restored to a healthy ecosystem, like this salt marsh, which we know is basically the sponge of ecosystems, and it in turn prevents risk for nearby communities. This strategy iterates over time as climate change becomes more and more extreme. You all will be not shocked at all to learn that, in fact, there are not a lot of 100-acre healthy salt marshes in Houston or New Orleans, or Staten Island for that matter. More often, we end up with a scene like this. A couple of families have the resources and know-how to get their houses bought out, and they leave. I'll spare you the details, but it's really the same old song. A racist bureaucracy does a poor job at lending its services to the people who need it most, leaving many cities across America peppered with vacant lots, and stranded homeowners waiting for the next storm no safer than before. And so retreat is happening, but it's certainly not managed and it's certainly not strategic in most cases. And this is where my work comes in. If you think about conservation organizations, they're traditionally they're experts at acquiring and restoring land. They're also great at policy advocacy, partnership building, and community engagements. And each of these are specific pieces of the puzzle to effective retreat. When you hear conservation, you might picture something like this: a pristine pocket, like I mentioned earlier with the watershed. Not a human in sight, maybe there's some rare birds nesting nearby, no footprints, and for good reason. This is important work. But in the face of climate change, many leaders within these organizations, some of whom I'm honored to call mentors, recognize that just keeping ecosystems pristine is simply not enough. Moreover, these visionaries can see how well positioned the Nature Conservancy and other organizations like it are to fight climate change with nature on our side. And so the bulk of my work was developing detailed case studies. I did a lot of review of the literature and found that in order for conservation organizations to move forward in this work, they needed to know the specifics: partnerships, funding, how, in fact, projects were successful examples of buyouts that lead to resilience. So I interviewed experts at all levels of government, municipal to federal, scientists, engineers, and conservation practitioners from many different organizations. And here's just 2 examples of some that I really liked. One is Cascades Park in Tallahassee, Florida. They've turned an industrial waste site, used to be an old factory, into a community park that holds concerts, even the Beach Boys. And when it floods, the amphitheater doubles as a stormwater storage facility. They've funded it through some really creative tax mechanisms. And for what it's worth, we've been talking a lot about floods, but the same holds for fires. 120 people sheltered in Billy Park, pictured here on the right, in Paradise, California, as one of the deadliest and most expensive and destructive wildfires raged around them. The unique open space management of Billy Park kept these people safe until the firefighters were able to rescue them. And as many people from across lots of different groups are coming together to rebuild Paradise, they're looking to Billy Park as an example of how open space can be both a public amenity, and literally a lifesaver during a natural disaster. And so the reports and case studies and literature review that I delivered to the Nature Conservancy helped them to clarify the crucial role that they have to play in climate adaptation strategy, specifically in strategic retreat. They can use their expertise in partnering with local communities to achieve scaled buy-in. They can advocate for equitable and just policies so that all people are able to move out of harm's way if they want to. And they can ensure that when ecosystems are restored, it is done effectively to reduce the risks of climate change. And so with that, I hope that you have seen how this past year has taught me a bit about what resilient climate adaptation might look like in agriculture and urban settings. In agricultural settings, to me, it's farms that sink carbon and support healthy ecological and human communities. In urban settings, it might be cities that strategically make way for nature and protect vulnerable communities. And so let's revisit those blunt truths that I presented to you earlier and revise them a little bit. We have to begin to heal our relationship with the land and with each other. Our society is extremely vulnerable to climate change, and we do have the solutions at our fingertips. Our racial inequality crisis is deeply intertwined with our climate crisis, and we must address both together. And with that, I want to say mahalo nui loa. I've put my email here if anyone has any questions about any of my work or just wants to reach out and talk about our hope for the future. Thank you.